Thank you very much, Emily, and thanks everyone for looking awake. I hope you're really awake. So this is going to be very short, and it's about the tracking tool that Fergus talked about early in the morning. Out of the HLP of 2019 came the Committee on Wild Food Security policy recommendations, 5 of them that came out of that whole consultative, deeply engaged process. And some of the early criticisms that we got when we started this process was, how does it resonate or align with the 13 principles? Well, it does. We've kind of looked at the 5 policy recommendations, and we believe that the CFS policy recommendations are actually a plausible policy pathway or a roadmap to food systems transformation, because it speaks the language of policymakers. These details are really nice, but this is not the language of the political economy. This is not how policy people conceive and live in the real world. That involves cutting a check on taxpayers' money and earning a return on that investment through an electoral cycle. So these 5 recommendations kind of track very easily in the policy speak. I'm not going to dwell too much on the methodology because of time, but we looked at 63 specific priority areas that were set in the original document of the CFS, and we abstracted 25 specific recommendations that we used to create a matrix to then evaluate national policy statements against. So we have reviewed sectoral policy strategies and actually even statutes around environment, land, water, agriculture, health, livestock, finance, and trade, and even the Constitution. We've done this for Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania, hence kind of the East Africa pilot. And the basic objective for doing that was to identify, as Fergus mentioned in the morning, what are those perverse provisions in existing policy and statutes, or even institutional design that would constrain that path to food systems transformation, around which you can then create an engagement and have a discussion with policymakers if you can suggest a plausible alternative that has political economic traction. The other one was also to identify existing provisions, because it's not enough. It actually is a really bad strategy to show up in a government office and just tell them how terrible they are, and then hope that you will get a warm reception the next time you ask for a meeting. So it also helps to kind of look at where is it that governments already are kind of leaping ahead, even beyond the provisions of the CFS policy. But what we need to understand is that these policy recommendations were created outside the kind of objective consultative process of public policy making. And a lot of these policies predate the CFS policy. So what we're trying to do is just to look at resonance and then find opportunities for potentially new conversations around policy reform. As Fergus also mentioned, it's also critical to assess civil society perspectives on how the current laws and policies and provisions align with global and international, global national commitments. How do you hold government accountable? That's really the kind of horizon data of civil society organizations. So very quickly, what are we learning? Across the 5 countries, all governments are strongly committed to food systems transformation, to raising productivity, to livelihoods and prosperity. And it helps to understand that nearly 70% of GDP in these 3 countries is attributable to agriculture indirectly, but 35% in Kenya, for example, about 40 in Uganda and Tanzania is directly attributed to agriculture. So agriculture is not just about feeding people. It's about incomes and revenues and government staying capable of feeding and functioning as states. So they are providing all kinds of policy incentives to increase productivity, hoping that you can draw a straight line from increases in productivity to household prosperity to national economic growth. So the use of organic nutrient resources is encouraged. So let's not kind of make any mistakes about this. The problem is that there are no incentives to promote access and adoption. They talk about manure, they talk about compost, they talk about all of these things that are agroecological, but there is no incentive. The incentive is on fertilizer, in organic fertilizer. There's also a strong emphasis on across these countries, Uganda, Tanzania, and Kenya, and even Ethiopia, on priority crops. And these are commercial agricultural crops. The tea, they think about wheat also as an export crop. They think about coffee, they think about pyrethrum, and all these other kind of tree crop-based systems, including avocado and mangoes. This implicitly undermines kind of the trajectory to building a stronger diversification within farm households and could undermine resilience in the long term. So governments are not doing this deliberately, but it's inadvertent, but you can see where it's going to go because you're really simplifying these production systems and you're also creating a kind of like a driveway for intensification in the agro-industrial way. So there's a lot of kind of feedback types of interactions going on here. There's also a very strong focus that relates to this to very strong export markets that are again associated with the subsidy, with monocrops and all of that. It then kind of ensures that they stay on the fertilizer treadmill because that's the only way that they know how to do this. Now, if you look at all of the elements around securing social responsibility, that's not a great way to encourage participation when you're outward facing in terms of building and rigging infrastructure and policy incentives to support external markets, to support export commodities. You're not developing local markets, you're not encouraging local exchange and retaining local revenues in these communities. Again, governments are strong on extension and digital digital transitions to extension. The problem is that it's not a kind of like it's not a two-way engagement. It's more of a top-down, here's what we're going to do. We'll take all this information, create an app and send it to farmers. So there's no space for co-creation and mainstreaming local knowledge that is really at the heart of agroecological transitions because it is a knowledge-intensive model compared to more input-intensive model. So again, how do you kind of square that? So then what has been kind of a great stroke of luck is that as we were reviewing the policies and the statutes and strategies, there was a groundswell of a new generation of organic and agroecological strategies across these countries. Uganda led with the organic agriculture policy. Then Tanzania has just recently launched its ecological and organic agriculture strategy. In Kenya, we've been 1 year into the process developing the national agroecological strategy. So, and all of these are strongly aligned, actually, some are even phrased in the words of the CFS policy recommendations. So we might actually just say, our job is done, let's go home. Because, we can now check all the boxes and say we can track and see CFS policy recommendations. They're very big on these three areas. Resource efficiency, they're very big on strengthening resilience, and they're very big on securing social equity. But they're really kind of bogged down with the technical investment and political barriers that constrain the scale of the transition ambition. Again, it's where you're going to find these inputs to create that train that moves from kind of that favors, in Fergus's language, the use of organic resources and moves away from inorganics. What are those? Where is the science in terms of understanding where these interventions where these inputs would work, where you'd produce them at scale. Where's the investment from private sector to actually drive this to scale? There are political barriers because of the political economy of input systems, especially fertilizer. And this is the story of Kenya, Malawi, and all these countries that are involved in this bulk purchase of fertilizers. In terms of strength and resilience, it implicates redesign of these landscapes. Again, at a landscape governance level, there are critical knowledge gaps, for example. And I think there's also just kind of cognitive barriers to making the transition. A lot of us sitting in this room rarely imagine the world beyond the plot. We're not landscape type people in the way that we think about these. So we'll be working with 1,000 farmers cut across the landscape. We don't have very strong basis for recognizing a watershed in which all of these investments should coalesce to then create the ecosystem service at the scale that would cause the transformation that agroecology envisages. So there are issues here, and then of course governance issues, but also that also constrain that. Securing equity, again, how do you re-embed food systems at the local level? What are the questions around gender equity and inclusion, natural resource governance related to that? So while these statements are there, this is where I think the minefields are in terms of really kind of moving these to the next level. And I think for the TPP, this is what ought to keep us worried, that now the governments are actually doing what we want them to do. The problem is going to be, can these things see the light of day? Now, so the audacity of these new strategies is compelling. But the halls of government are also tombs of generations of unimplemented strategies and unenforced laws. So are we just piling on this heap of dysfunction, tick box exercise? And how are you going to make sure that these policies, these strategies can actually work in the real world and do these things and provide the capacity for them to actually work in the real world through these levers? Again, sectoral silos. The silo structure hasn't changed. Governments are not amenable to agroecology. So those silos do not really support the process of concerted, engaged coordination. And it requires that we create new institutions to drive that process, that we probably even reorganize government and how government functions in a much more kind of multifaceted way. Now, I can see Emily is winking at me, and I'm sure she's saying something very obvious. So again, there's an inadequacy of unfit, inadequate or unfit institutions. Again, where the durable, credible, multi-stakeholder platforms. And as Anne and I were discussing over lunch, I think the process in creating the platforms is also important. What is the journey? Who do you need around the table? And how do you, because the process then would create the durability and the credibility of these MSPs. And again, part of what's going to constrain all of these is reliance on short-term donor funding. I think we need to move to private sector investment and public sector spending. The Kenya government spends 2.3% of its GDP on agriculture. That is just pathetic. And I don't think you can move the needle in the way that we want to move the needle in these investments. So to finish, what should we do for agroecological transformation of food systems as a TPP? I think here's where we need to support these processes that are already very encouraging. Mobilizing for partnerships, especially mobilizing partnerships for advocacy, demand rather than supply-driven model of engagement with advocacy groups, because they have street credibility, and it's really in their place to push their governments. They're a critical part of the electoral constituency that governments would often pay attention to. How do we listen and work with advocacy groups? What is the evidence-based, and Rosina and I were discussing this, how do we support civil society and groups like Pelham, for instance, with evidence-based advocacy? How do we get the evidence in the hands of advocacy groups? All the discussions we've had here, it's got to leave this room. It's got to go to the frontline organizations that are out there, and capacity for advocacy organizations. Investments that the landscape and territorial scale. A lot of what George was talking about and what TLI is talking about, beyond the plot level, short-term funding, to multi-year philanthropic investments at landscape scale, increased public sector investments. How do you put pressure on government to start putting the money where their mouth literally is? And that's in the food, to feed their populations. Private sector investment across the food systems. George talks about value networks. And again, it's from consumption back to the farm in a circularity economy model, where everything harnessing the power and the energy of urbanization to make sure that all the stuff that we take out of the fields comes to, does not go to an urban landfill, but ends up on the farm again. The last one is institutional strengthening. Going back to the graveyard of policies, I think how do you help governments to overcome capability traps? My hypothesis is that there's a chronic implementation failure across many of these African countries. And I can say that with authority as an African, because this is the experience that I live. So it's not, I would not be insulting the governments. I would be just speaking truth to power in a kind of nice way. So how do we support governments to actually implement the policies that we spend so much time and resources to produce? So thank you very much.